So it's actually rare that I get to address a military audience, and I wanted to leave a lot of time for questions and conversation because I suspect the things you want me to talk about aren't what I think I want to talk about. But there are 4 points I want to make to start that I think are relevant to cyber conflict and things that we have to really pay attention to from a broad policy level down to a tactical level. Attribution is a fundamental problem on the internet and something that's really difficult. Right? It's difficult for a whole bunch of reasons. It's difficult for real technical reasons. Right? Packets don't come with their return addresses. And it's different because it's really easy to false flag. Right? It's really easy for attackers to pretend to come from somewhere else. Right? Certainly that's done a lot in cybercrime, done a lot in espionage, and done a lot in cyber attack. Right? The North Korean attack against Sony, they tried to hide their tracks. Any of the Chinese attacks against the US, I guarantee you when the NSA attacks people, they go through China because I would. Right? All attacks come from China. Right? So it's not false flagging in a traditional sense where you're painting the blame on somebody else. It's more obfuscation. It's false flagging in a way that no one knows where the attack comes from. And that's real interesting. When I give this talk, I often compare, just because it's a good example, to Israeli operations. A 2006 air attack against a Syrian nuclear power plant, where the Syrians could look up and see the planes and know where the attack came from. The 2010 attack against the Iranian nuclear power plant, which was Stuxnet, a cyber weapon, and the Iranians didn't know who did it unless you guys called them up on a diplomatic channel and said, hey, that was us. Now, a lot of the thinking about this comes from a Cold War, game theory, government actions against each other. And there's a robust literature on attribution, when countries want to hide the origins, and then often countries don't. The difference here is that we have a lot of non-state actors. Makes this much more complicated. Right? The Sony attack was widely believed to be the work of a couple of guys in a basement somewhere. Why? Because the previous attack that looked the most like that, which was the attack against HB Gary Federal in 2010, was the result of a couple of guys in a basement somewhere. Right? And the next attack that seems to be like that, which is the massive data leak out of Saudi Arabia, is likely also a couple of guys in a basement somewhere. Right? That makes this difficult. Attribution is hard. When we manage to attribute attacks, it can take a long time. And this is variable. Right? It took 3 weeks for the United States to eventually decide that Sony was attacked by North Korea. Right? 3 weeks is a long time. There are other attacks that are different. I have a little list. Right, the Office of Personnel Management attack, which was China, took us a few days. Duku, the malware that Kaspersky announced, about a month ago now, widely attributed to you guys, right? Took about a year. And think of how that was attributed, largely because of who the victims are. A lot of attribution ends up being looking at the victim. So we had one piece of malware, I forget the name of it, and you looked at the victim list, and it was all the Hispanic countries in South America plus Gibraltar. Right? It doesn't take a astute historian of world history to think, well, that's probably Spain. Or there was old malware from, which is widely attributed to China, GhostNet. You looked at about 200 different targets when we were able to actually go to the controller node, and it really was a who's who's list of who China wants to spy on. From the Dalai Lama, which nobody else cares about, right? And we see a lot of that. And there you can again see the possibility of false flagging. But if you are, I'm going to make this up, Argentina, and you want to cast the blame on somebody else, go spy on Gibraltar. Not because you care about Gibraltar, because when you're discovered, then it looks like it's Spain. So attribution's hard. There's a huge problem with misattribution, because rarely do you get solid evidence. And we haven't seen it yet, but I've seen a lot of talk after cyber attacks in the US about striking back when we actually don't know who it is. I mean, there was one attack, I remember, it was a few years ago, which you attributed to either North Korea, China, London, or Florida. Now, we could fire back, but that would be awkward if it were Florida. And this makes that hard. So there's an arms race here. There's a deception, attribution arms race. From technologies to hide your attribution, technologies to figure it out. And what's interesting in this, a couple of interesting things about this arms race. One, the United States is in a singular advantage here. Right, for a couple of reasons. One, we spend more money on global eavesdropping than everybody else combined. And so much internet traffic naturally goes through the US that we have a singular position to see what's happening. And I have a quote in 2012. This is the US Secretary of Defense, Leon Panetta. And he's saying publicly, "We have made significant advances in identifying the origins of cyber attacks." Right? Interesting quote. Now, we don't know what that means, really. We don't know if it means that the US has some secret technology to identify the origins of packets. I kind of doubt it. I suspect more it is something like the NSA is saying, look, our espionage is so good that we are so deeply embedded in everybody else's planning processes that if something happens, we'll just know. And we actually know that the North Korean attribution of Sony was, at least in part, a result of our espionage of the North Korean government. That it wasn't just seeing the packets go by, that it was seeing the planning process. Now, what's interesting is that strong attribution leads to deterrence. I think it's interesting, we're seeing the United States be much more aggressive in saying they did it. You know, we very quickly said that the OPM attack was China. We've indicted 5 Chinese nationals as absentia for cyber attacks against US corporate networks. We identified Russia as the origin of some attacks against the White House, identified North Korea. A few years ago, we wouldn't have done that. And I think what's going on is some strong signaling. Signaling to the world that if you try something, we will know it's you. Right? There's a reason why we would want to be aggressive in identifying origins, in ascribing attribution. Because it shows you're not going to get away with anything. And again, this gets complicated because you have nation states and non-nation states. I think what's interesting is to watch the non-nation states move up in capability. Well, I'm going to talk about that later. One of the problems with attribution on the net today is that it's largely based on secret evidence. There are several levels of attribution. If you sort of think about it in degree of difficulty, there's I know you did it. There's I know you did it and it can convince you I know you did it. And there's I know you did it and it can convince the world I know you did it. Think about Sony. We did 1, probably did 2. We were terrible at number 3. Why? Because number 2 and number 3, to a different degree, involve secret evidence. Right? For order for the United States to convince the world, technically, that Sony did it, as opposed to please trust us, is probably to reveal a whole bunch of sources and methods. Right? That's hard. We're not used to doing that. But if we expect our citizens, the world, to go along with whatever retaliatory action we're going to take, that's going to be increasingly important. So they're going to see a lot more tensions now between the secrecy of surveillance operations and the need to make public the results of these surveillance operations. What this means in the near term is that figuring out who's in charge of defense becomes difficult. I'm really going to give you a United States perspective here, and I don't know the integration of civilian police and military here in Israel. Right? In the United States, when you're attacked in cyberspace, there are a variety of institutions you can call on to defend you. The police, the military, Department of Homeland Security, a bunch of commercial products and services, your corporate lawyers. And when you're attacked, if you are a corporation under attack, like Sony, The legal regime in which your defense operates depends on two things: who's attacking you and why. And if you think about it, in cyberspace, the exact two things you don't know is who's attacking you and why. This makes defense difficult. This makes it difficult to figure out what the default defense is. And we're seeing a lot of policy debates. It's not really who's in charge of defending Sony, but it's who's in charge of defending Sony before we can figure out who's in charge of defending Sony. Is it the NSA's job? Is it the police's job? Is it Sony's job? What do you do in the seconds, days, weeks, potentially, where you don't know the attribution? How do you figure out defense? Right? When it could be either. I mean, it's incredible, and I think that it can't be overstated. It is truly incredible that we had debates in December about whether a major cyber attack against a US corporation was the work of a world government with a $20 billion military budget or a couple of guys in the basement somewhere. Right? That was a legitimate debate. We couldn't tell the difference. And this goes into my second point. We're seeing a democratization of tactics. Right? It used to be you could tell the attacker by the weaponry. We looked outside, we saw a tank, we would know that some military, hopefully yours, was involved because only militaries could afford tanks. That doesn't work in cyberspace. Everyone is using the same tactics, the same techniques, the same tools. Right? Nation states are using the same stuff as non-nation states. And this democratization makes policy difficult because you can't tell. It also means this balancing attack and defense is difficult. I don't know in the room how many of you are attackers and how many of you are defenders. I was told to think of you guys as the Israeli NSA, and the NSA has both. It has the SIGINT side, has the ComSec side. And next door is US Cyber Command, which is actually the attack side. But there's a belief, and it's sort of interesting to watch. When I was, about 2 years ago, when I was working on the Snowden documents, the one thing that the NSA did not want me to release, I mean, they were pleading for me not to, was quantum. And quantum, I don't know if you know it by the American code name or just by the Snowden documents, is the NSA's ability to do packet injection from the backbone. It's a pretty clever attack, and if you don't know it through your classified channels, go read the documents. There's some really cool stuff that you can do when you can do packet injection into the backbone. And there are like a dozen or 24 different quantum programs. Quantum was this big NSA secret. The thing is, it actually wasn't. But there was, even before Snowden, a hacker tool that does packet injection. It's called AirPawn. And it does packet injection in wireless networks. I mean, the attackers didn't have access to the backbone, but it is a hacker tool you can download and use and do packet injection in wireless documents, take over wireless networks, take over computers. We know that the Great Firewall of China uses packet injection. We know that the Chinese Great Cannon uses packet injection. That this secret NSA program actually isn't. And then after I saw it, I looked in the literature. I found a couple of academic papers that talked about it. A few months ago, I noticed some professor was basically assigning building quantum as a graduate-level homework assignment in his class. And this differentiation between classified military and hacker tools is very narrow. Right? Today's classified secret programs becomes tomorrow's PhD theses, and the next day's hacker tools. And we see that again and again. Another technology, which in the United States, I assume here too, is very secret, is Stingray. I mean, Stingray is actually a trade name. Company's Harris Corporation. Basically, it's an IMSI catcher. It's a fake cell phone tower. You put it up. You can collect information from cell phones. You can get location information, you can eavesdrop on calls, you can do a lot of really impressive things. The FBI treats this as an extraordinary secret. I'll sort of spare you the details, but they've been impressive in their denials of it existing, even to the extent of if someone is arrested because of stingray evidence and they challenge it in court, the case will be dropped rather than the NSA, the FBI having a talk about it. Right? Massive secret, except that it isn't. These IMSI catchers are actually very common. We've seen talks at DEF CON for 3-4 years. People are building them. It costs about $2,000 these days. If you go right now on Alibaba.com, you can buy your own IMSI catcher. It costs you about $1,500. The Chinese use this, and I'm not making this up, to send SMS spam. Right? They're everywhere. And there are now companies in the US that are selling IMSI catcher detectors for organizations that are worried about this. Now, another thing that happened last year, some magazine, I forget which one, started looking for these IMSI catchers in Washington, D.C. Found like 30 or 40 of them around government buildings, embassies, run by, we have no idea who. Right? This is the world. We cannot, well, the phrase I use is we have one world, we have one internet, and one answer. I cannot build an infrastructure that allows the good guys to spy and the bad guys not to. Right? Either, indeed, right? I mean, that's relative, but you know, I can't, I mean, assuming I'm building, my guys are the good guys, right? The other guys are the bad guys. Right? I can either build a world where everyone can spy or nobody can spy. Right? I can build the internet backbone such that quantum doesn't work, which means the NSA can't use it and the Chinese can't use it. Or I can build an internet where the quantum does work, where they both can use it. Right? Same thing with my cell phone network. I can add authentication so that those stingrays don't work, which will protect our assets, our secrets, but will deny our eavesdropping. Right? Again, and we're going to see that again and again. We're going to see this trade-off. Right? We're seeing it right now in the crypto wars. I don't know if you're following US policy or UK, but there's yet another call to make encryption bad, basically to add backdoors so that the government can eavesdrop on communications. Right? I can build that technically. Right? I can build a backdoor in a crypto system. Well, I call it a vulnerability. Somebody call it something else. But I cannot build a backdoor that only operates in the presence of a certain piece of paper. Right? You know, so I can't build only works when there's a warrant. I can build only works when somebody, you know, with the right key does, but I can build a technical system that allows access, then I have to rely on a social system to enforce my policy. Or I can build a technical system that doesn't allow access, and then I don't need my social system. And I think we're going to see a lot of more debates there. You know, I worry that we are going to lose our long-term security in a short-term effort to allow for eavesdropping. A little more about this democratization. That I think as we are seeing these techniques flow downhill, right, from governments to hackers to criminals, you know, or flow uphill, as we see them back and forth, we're seeing increasing vulnerability in our systems. And so the last thing I want to talk about is encryption. You know, encryption's a very valuable tool, but it's not a panacea. Right? There's no doubt in my mind that if the NSA or the Chinese government or the Russians or you guys wanted to be in my computer, you'd be in my computer. Period, done. Right? I don't stand a chance. If they're not, right? If any of those governments are not in my computer, one of two things is true. One, it's against the law, and that organization's choosing to follow the law. Or two, I'm not high enough on the priorities list. Right? What encryption does is it forces the listener to target. A lot of the abuses we have in surveillance come from broad surveillances of population. right? Chinese government surveilling everybody. And encryption can protect against that. Right? By adding encryption into networks, we prevent the listeners from listening on everybody and force them to target. Right? As listeners, you will not like that. Right? But as people who want security, you will like that. Right? Again, one world, one network, one answer. I think we are much safer when the authorities we trust have to target. Right? I'm good with the FBI getting warrants and eavesdropping. Right? That is a perfectly reasonable way to solve crimes. I am less good about a government, whether it's mine, yours, or anybody's, being able to eavesdrop on everybody. And that's why I push for strong encryption ubiquitously into systems. Because the threats are numerous and complicated. And by defending against them, we build up security. Security is more important than surveillance, I think, long-term going forward. I mean, I don't think I could ever stop point surveillance, but I don't think that's what I want to do. I mean, that particular arms race, that particular battle is going to be fought over decades. And as long as endpoint security is so bad, we'll never get to the point where the math can protect you. Okay, it's always going to be the code. And the code's much more vulnerable than the math. But code requires targeting. And that feels like a good thing to me. So I'm happy to take questions, which I did. Good. I want to leave a lot of time for, because I'm hoping it'll be interesting. Yes?
In the past decade, cyber warfare has become public knowledge. Everyone knows it exists. Do you think that there will be some kind of paranoia, the public, the corporations, that will hinder and hurt technological advancements?
You know, so we're talking about cyber war and paranoia. I think what's the worry is less warfare. I mean, to me, any actual war has a cyberspace component, but these more low-level cyber conflicts. And the worry is that we're all going to be in the blast radius. Right? That when North Korea wants to strike back at the US, they attack Sony. Or when, or that company, Stuxnet, right, affected a bunch of companies that weren't, the target wasn't the Iranian nuclear power plant. And I think that's more the worry. China attacked GitHub earlier this year. That these nation-state attacks against non-nation states, right? Iran getting back at Stuxnet by attacking the Saudi oil company. The US attacking the Brazilian oil company. So I think there's less of a worry about cyber war as warfare, although there's a lot of bad rhetoric. The term's really lousily used. So in the United States, I don't know if you do that here, but we actually hate to use the term war to describe actual wars. And we use anything else but war to talk about wars. But we love to use the term war in a rhetorical context. War on crime, war on drugs, war on poverty, war on terrorism. Right? When there's no actual war going on, we like the term. Now, it's very confusing in cyber war because you have aspects of both. It's kind of like the war on crime, and it's kind of like an actual war. So the term in the United States is really bad for policy because it puts a military veneer on what is largely a civilian issue. But I think if there is going to be any blowback, it is going to be from these low-level cyber attacks done by nation states that are not just affecting nation states. Right, this Chinese attack against the Office of Personnel Management, I mean, affects back all government employees in the United States. And that is freaking people out. Right? And the question is, you know, where was, I mean, the NSA actually had the job to defend, right, US government networks. Where were they? So there might be, but I think it's going to be along those lines. Please.
You mentioned retaliation and attribution as a means of stopping attacks. But it seems to me right now there's sort of a barrier between cyberspace and anything else. It seems almost unthinkable that the response to the attack on Sony would be some sort of physical response.
So officially United States doctrine is, and it was probably like 2 years ago, that we will treat an attack in cyberspace like any other attack, and we will respond by the means we deem best, whether it is a cyber response or a kinetic response. You know, that pronouncement was received very negatively in the United States, but I think it's perfectly reasonable, right? That because you can, in cyberspace, have attacks that do physical damage. So I suspect you're going to see more of that blending.
Seems to me that the time is right now for some government to set the tone. One specific response that will set the standard.
Yeah, you know, and it's sort of interesting to why there haven't been a lot of real responses. So the response against North Korea was we sanctioned North Korea in early January. Actually, I have no idea what that means. North Korea is the most heavily sanctioned nation on the planet. There's nothing left to do to them. But supposedly we sanctioned them. Right? The response against Stuxnet was the attack against Saudi Aramco. I don't think we have seen other responses that have risen to the level of public. I mean, I don't know what's going on in diplomatic back channels. I don't know what's going on at attacks against military installations that just never made the press. But you're right, we just don't have a history of doctrine. We have stated doctrine, but we don't have it actually used. You know, our response to China has largely been legal. I mean, there's a lot of complication in U.S.-China relations. I mean, they own so much U.S., it's kind of hard to respond. But so we have been indicting people and accusing them without any real responses. But you know the U.S. is attacking China as good as it's getting. So I'm sure a lot is going on in the background. I think you're right. I mean, we are seeing, and it's worth looking at some of the U.S. military journals on cyber war doctrine. People are writing about it and thinking about it. One of the problems, I think it's a real important problem, is that, at least I mean, it's probably here too, in the United States, certainly, the legal regime for espionage and attack are very different. Right? This is why espionage is the NSA and attack is U.S. Cyber Command. They are different organizations under very different rules. But technically, they're basically exactly the same, which is why they're in the same building and the same general runs them both in the United States. And as a defender, this is difficult because no matter what you're doing, you have, 24 steps to get into somebody's network, and the difference between the NSA and US Cyber Command is the last line. Is it copy star dot star or is it delete star dot star? And until then, you have no idea whether you're being spied on or being attacked. That's a very difficult situation. And I'm not sure how we're going to deal with that. I mean, you'll see some talk of treating espionage as attack for that very reason, that it looks like an attack. And this is worrisome because it's destabilizing. Because what do you do as a defender when you watch someone come in? You have to assume the worst. So, how do you respond? I saw a hand there first, and I'll go there.
Okay, so as a law-abiding citizen, I hope, wouldn't you
There are a lot of laws,
wouldn't you feel safer if criminals had to think twice or three times before they did anything because they know there's surveillance watching over them all the time?
So criminals already have to think twice or three times when they do anything?
One more time.
Well, no. I mean, so the question is, are we safer if the government can watch over all criminals? I mean, the narrow answer is yes, but that's not what you get. You can't have that. I can't give you that. I can give you the government watching over everybody or nobody. I mean, I can't, say, okay, you can watch over those 7 people.
So, what I'm asking,
right.
they watch over everybody.
Right. So no. I think the dangers of living in a police state and living in a surveillance state are so incredibly great that this is a place, like in so many areas, we deliberately limit police power to make us safer. Right? The warrant process is an example. I mean, wouldn't you be safer if the police could just shoot criminals on sight without any worry? Well, yes. But the problem is, you watch the US, they get it wrong all the time. So I want systems in place that force the police to clear some legal hurdle before they do any of that.
But when they really want to, they don't have to.
When they really want to know, and that is a problem. And it's one, I think it's one we have to address. I think we do have to address extra-legal surveillance. But no, I think that security against all listeners is safer than eavesdropping by all listeners. Because remember, I can't just give the police that authority, because that authority now exists. Now it's any criminal that can link in. In the first crypto wars, I don't know if people remember, this is in the 90s. There was huge debates about cryptography in the United States and giving the police the back doors. And I remember someone from the Drug Enforcement Agency of the United States who was terrified of this because he was convinced that the major drug kingpins of the world had enough capability to be able to piggyback onto that system. Right? That the system is built so the police can eavesdrop on criminals, which we agree we like, and it's now being used by drug dealers to eavesdrop on everybody. Right? So I can't, as long as I can't separate those two, I'd rather have the security. I'm confident that police can solve crimes. I mean, it's not like we lived in a lawless society, then suddenly electronic surveillance, and now we're suddenly stopping crimes. Right? We did really good in the hundreds and thousands of years before the internet. I suspect we're going to do pretty good afterwards. But I can't build the system that the government wants, because I can't exclude listeners to the degree that they want. But I saw a hand over here and then the hand over there.
You talked about crimes and major battlefields like nations and drug dealers, but how about the citizen, the person, like crimes like, if I can make it the same point as robbers and kidnappers, how can we pass laws and make arrests by cyber on the private citizen, not by nations and drug dealers and big stuff?
So, and I think that the answer is going to be targeting. I mean, a lot of the crimes, the cyber crimes, tend to be the large-scale identity thefts. Right? Huge problem in the United States. I don't know if it is here. Right? If you remember Target Corporation or Home Depot, where a criminal goes into basically to a retailer which has mediocre computer security, steals everyone's financial data, uses that to commit fraud. Right? Recently, we had that against the IRS, the United States Tax Authority. It's a big crime, and it's a huge growing area of fraud in the United States, that criminals file false tax returns in people's names, get refunds, and then leave. I mean, it's amazing how much money is being lost in this. Right? So we have two problems here. We have the financial data is not well protected. But the other one is the financial data is valuable. That I can, if I break into an online retailer, steal information about someone in order to basically will steal money from them. Right? So I have two ways of securing that. I can try to make the data more secure. I can try to make the data less valuable. I tend to like the less valuable solutions. They seem more robust. Right? The other type of crime I think you were talking about are conventional crimes that have a cyberspace component. Right? So I'm going to make this up, a kidnapper using the internet to communicate. Now, how are we going to solve those? You know, I think we'll do pretty well. We've solved kidnappings in the past few hundred years, and we're not suddenly stopping. Right? And this temporary blip of communications being recorded is just narrow. Right? It used to be, go back to the 80s, the communications were all ephemeral. Right? And we were solving kidnappings through all the techniques we would use with ephemeral communications. Now communications are less ephemeral, but you know, those techniques still exist. I mean, I see the last 150 years as an extraordinary advancement in police technologies, right? Ranging from fingerprints to actually the most important development in police ever, the radio, right, which allowed the police to call for backup. It changed completely how policing works. Anyone with 24 forensics technologies. Right? On balance, I think we're doing way better than we were. And I think giving up broad eavesdropping, one, I think we're not giving up very much, and two, we're still way ahead, and three, we're much more secure by doing it. I mean, to me, the way to think of this is not do the police spy or not. It's does everybody spy or nobody spy. And if you allow the police to spy in this country, you are allowing every country around you to also spy on you. Right? And that's where I think security is more important than surveillance. I mean, we do better living in a society where things are secure and spying is the exception than living in, a sort of East German-like society where spying is the norm and security is the exception. That's my cell phone.
I had a question actually.
And he invited me, so he gets to ask it.
Okay. Spy organizations often say that if you have nothing to hide, you shouldn't be afraid of espionage.
Mm-hmm.
So I would like to hear your
So I mean, it's a common refrain. If you have nothing to hide, you have nothing to fear. I mean, and I think that's a very narrow view of privacy. Privacy is not about something to hide. Privacy is about human dignity. It's about presenting yourself to the world. It's about being in charge of your own person. That when we talk to a friend and say things or not, it's not because we have something to hide. It's because we have a certain relationship, and we get to decide how we present ourselves. That when we are living under surveillance, we lose a lot of our fundamental humanity. We lose a lot of our dignity. And we are less free to think new thoughts. We are less free to have new ideas. I spent a lot of time on this in my book, which I only didn't bring enough for all of you. That privacy is incredibly important to us as people. I mean, no one says, oh yes, let's build East Germany. Right? Let's go back, let's build a society like Hussein's Iraq. That a large surveillance society is valid. China, we're all going to move there because they have great surveillance. Right? No one thinks that way. Because with surveillance comes a lot of other things. And a lot of what makes us free is the ability to do things not in the public gaze, right? Not in the gaze of the authorities. And aside from the fact that the definition of something to hide changes. Lots of historical examples of personal information being used to round up people, to segregate people, to discriminate, and in extreme circumstances to incarcerate and kill. Right? That's done all the time on modern Earth. So I tend not to be a big fan of it. Oh, heavens. That's all of you. All right, all speak at once. No, don't do that. I'm going to go back there.
Okay, so far you've mentioned the problems. I would like to focus on solutions. Name, in your opinion, please, one or two trends, cybersecurity trends, which will change the landscape.
All right, so I think there are some.
Could you repeat the question?
Okay, questions about cybersecurity trends that are positive that will change the landscape. The one thing I am most bullish on right now is the final realization that we need response capabilities. That we are recognizing, I think finally, that we cannot keep the attackers out. We need to figure out what to do after attacks happen. And this took decades, right? The 1990s was a decade of prevention. Right? Buy a firewall, buy antivirus, and you'll be magically made secure. And people believed that and bought that. Absolute nonsense. In the 2000s, we spent the decade talking about attack detection, IDSs and other SIMs and ways to detect attacks. And now finally we're looking at response. What do you do after the attackers are in to kick them out, to isolate them, to identify them, to restore security? And I think that is an extraordinarily positive trend. That'll finally complete. I mean, to me, security is protection, detection, and response, all three. I mean, you take any physical analogy and those that you have, and that progression is what gives you resilience, and I think that is a positive term I'm seeing more. Right? How do we become resilient despite insecurity? Now, I don't think we're going to have any fundamental advances in cybersecurity that will change the fact that the endpoints, that the devices are horribly insecure. We have no idea how to build security devices. I can do cryptography, that's easy, right? But computer security is very hard. And in that world, I need to build more resilience against attacks. So I think that is a great trend, and I'd like to see more of it. The other positive trend I mentioned before is ubiquitous encryption in the backbone. That anything the IETF does to add encryption, right, to make any of you bulk listeners your job harder. And of course, any bulk listener not in this room, and they outnumber you by a lot, to make their job harder, but make us all more secure against all those listeners, I think is incredibly positive. Again, I want to force the listeners to target. So I think those are very positive trends. I mean, the other trends tend to be around the policy realm. You know, that more, we're seeing more statements about the value of privacy, about the value of security and without backdoors, not subverting laws, not subverting technology. And those are more in the policy area. But those are the two tech trends that I like to see now. All right, I'm going to go there.
It's maybe different. What do you think about companies that spies over the users, like Google that has all the information wherever you've been by your GPS and all your search and videos on YouTube?
So the question is about corporate surveillance and companies that spy on their users. Now, and that's common. And we actually have built an internet that spies on people in exchange for services. Right? Google is an example of that. I look at corporate and government surveillance very similarly. And government surveillance piggybacks on corporate surveillance. Not like the NSA woke up in the morning and said, let's spy on the internet. They woke up in the morning and said, wow, all these companies are spying on the internet, let's go get ourselves a copy. Right? And they did through lots of means. Through legal compulsion, through subterfuge, through coercion, I mean, any way they could. Right? If you, to the listeners among you, you're probably doing a lot of the same things. Right? The government of Syria uses Facebook to figure out who to arrest, torture, and kill. I mean, so China does the same thing. Right? Countries are using corporate surveillance for their own purposes. This is scary. I do worry also about corporate surveillance in its own, because I believe we are getting to the point where manipulation based on surveillance is getting very sophisticated. And you know, sort of even at a low level, what companies like Google do is surveillance-based manipulation. It's advertising. They want to get you to buy something you wouldn't buy otherwise. That's getting subtler. That's getting more harder to resist. I mean, there's a lot more psychological research on this. And I wonder in this sort of other arms race between advertising and ignoring advertising, if one side has too much power. Right, we already saw, I don't know if you remember the Facebook experiment in tilting the US election. This was an experiment. They didn't actually do this for intent. They did this to demonstrate that basically they showed that if they put when you vote, you can announce it on Facebook and get like an I voted icon that you can show on your feed that your friends can see. And it turns out, if your friends see that, they are more likely to vote. At least in the United States, they are more likely to vote. Right? So there's some social pressure going on here. And Facebook demonstrated that. The thought experiment is, what if Facebook only did that to the people who voted for one party and not the other? They could. It's very easy in the United States to figure out party affiliation by the types of things you post and the things you comment on, the things you say. And we now know exactly how close an election has to be before Facebook could tip it. Now, that kind of freaks me out, because it isn't illegal for Facebook to do that. Now, we saw another Facebook experiment with making people happy and sad. You know, I've seen papers that talked about that one of the best ways to, and I'm sorry for the example, to market cosmetics to women is to make them feel insecure. Right? I'm sorry. This is marketing research. And so now the question is, and you can imagine this sort of in any type of sale. If we figure out what type of psychological state is best to sell a certain product, is it immoral for me to, one, selectively look for that state, or two, selectively try to induce that state? where are their lines? And I don't think we, really in any country, Europe has done more of this, but still not very much, really looked at the ethical implications of this kind of surveillance-based manipulation. So I do worry about it for that. I also worry about surveillance by companies like Google because it is a massive target. Right? China targets Gmail. Right? Because that's where the people they want to spy send emails. So we are putting a lot of our security in these third-party hands. Again, we're having this nation-state versus non-nation-state dichotomy. I mean, Google's got great security, but I don't think they stand a chance against the large nation-states of the world. I mean, it's night and day. Back there.
I have a question more about the American mindset, like the public mindset, when it comes to government espionage. I take Israel, for example. More or less, people know what we do here, and no one bats an eye. But ever since the Snowden leaks, the public has pretty much gone mad. How can they be spying on us? And it's like they don't even see the bigger picture that they're actually just trying to protect them. And I was wondering why that is such a dramatic response to this. I mean, they know, 9/11. It's as if they should know it's going on.
It's a question about Americans' response. The Americans' response has largely been to ignore things. I mean, the things we see tend to be around the edges because we follow the issues. In the mainstream press in the United States, the Snowden stories, I mean, the first one got a lot of press, the second one got some press, and now it's dribbled down to, there were some major Snowden stories from earlier this week, from like Monday. Some really interesting stuff the UK is doing, actually I think some pretty scary stuff, which didn't hit the press at all. There was that great story a couple of weeks ago, New York Times ProPublica, on stuff the NSA was doing for internet surveillance. Never got more press. So I think there's largely fatigue with the story. The whole notion of we're doing it for your own good, don't you realize that? All countries say that for all things. I assure you, China explains the Great Firewall to its citizens as we're doing it for your own good, don't you see that? Right? And the problem is here, do you trust your government? Should you trust your government? Now, I tend to be a fan of transparency. I think secret government's very scary and very dangerous. And I don't want the NSA doing things for my own good that involve secret laws and secret courts and secret interpretations and deciding themselves. I want to see transparency, oversight, and accountability. You are seeing attitudes change. It's sort of interesting to watch the debate last month about the Patriot Act reauthorization. So this was the place in the United States where there was NSA reform debated. I think the debate was largely ignorant. It didn't understand the bigger issues. Again, secrecy made this hard. The reforms were very minimal. They're perceived as a huge success. I think the NSA is thrilled that this is all that happened after 2 years of painful dragging out of their secrets. But I think attitudes are changing. I think people are realizing that this broad surveillance isn't good, even if it is being presented for their own good. And hopefully that change will happen. My guess is there's a couple of decades. I think we are seeing the sort of widespread, complete craziness as a result of 9/11. Let's completely ignore everything in this attempt to stop terror is waning. We're not yet to the point where people realize how much the United States, the FBI, manufactures terrorists, and how little the threat actually is. So there is still some inflated threat. That might take another decade or two. So I actually like seeing the skepticism. I think that's valuable. I think that's helpful, and I think that's going to be positive. But I'm not seeing enough of it. The one interesting survey, there was one in last November, I think. It was worldwide. I blogged it, so you can look it up, where someone asked people, countries all over the world, about their attitudes towards government surveillance and things they've done. And I ran the numbers, and what I found was, if you take the survey at face value, 700 million people on the planet have changed their behavior because of the Snowden revelations of NSA surveillance. Now, probably what they did didn't matter at all, wasn't useful. Some people probably lied about that. But what it says to me is that 700 million people over the past 12 months changed their opinion. And I think that's extraordinary. And I can't think of another issue ever that moves 700 million people in a year. So I think things are changing. Oh, heavens. Let's go there. Your hand is up, Pro.
What's in your mind the place of public security companies like Kaspersky on revealing global cyber threats such as
I think it's fantastic. I mean, they pull stuff off the board, right? And whether it's a Russian malware kit or one of yours or one of mine, I think that's awesome. I love that stuff, right? Because someone has to do something. I mean, all this militarization, all this spying, and when stuff like that is made public, we get to learn. We in the academic community, the commercial community, get to learn how to better defend against this stuff. I get that it pisses you off. I'm kind of sorry, but you're happy when it's a Russian one, right? But this is where we are, right? Either everybody or nobody. We're stuck with that. So yes, I like seeing that. We learn a lot. Turns out when you got a good budget in malware, you write some really cool malware. That's what we've learned. I gotta go to my next thing soon. This is sad. In the back.
Kaspersky compared the Duku attack against Kaspersky Labs to attacking a medic on the battle. Do you think that's a valid?
I thought that. So the question was about Kaspersky, and he wrote an op-ed, I think in Forbes, comparing the Duku to attacking medics on the battlefield. That felt like a stretch. That felt like hyperbole. I don't know if you ever met the guy. He's kind of a hyperbole sort of guy. Yeah, that felt a bit much. I mean, to be fair, he was taking it pretty personally because kind of it was. And one of the NSA stories from Monday was GCHQ in the UK targeting companies like Kaspersky.
Do you think they should be especially protected?
I think they should be regularly protected.
I wanted to ask you about IoT and about wearables and your opinion on the following challenges in cybersecurity.
I think Internet of Things is going to be a huge disaster for security. Primarily, a couple of reasons. I mean, one, it's like not the Internet of Things, it's the Internet of surveillance devices. And two, the economics of security don't transfer. If you think about it, it gets back to security, not surveillance. If you think about computer security, there's this whole ecosystem of putting stuff out there, finding vulnerabilities, patching them. And that works on computers, laptops, phones. It's not going to work on $5 embedded devices. That we're just not going to have the same level of expertise sticking around to do the update. We're seeing that already in home routers. That in many cases, the way you update your home router is to throw it away and buy a new one. There is no update path. We just don't know how to. And things tend to have a longer shelf life. We are used to replacing our computer, every 3 to 5 years, our phone every 3 to 5 years. I replace my home thermostat approximately never. Right? And that's going to make that, again, that's going to make the cycle of vulnerabilities difficult. So in the current world where vulnerabilities are plentiful and we get security through update, that process is going to fail us really badly as the cost of the devices get cheaper. So we're going to see a lot more vulnerabilities in things. And again, you're going to like that as listeners. You're going to hate that as defenders. All right. Not only is he asking a question, but someone is pointing at him.
Sorry.
It's okay. Kind of got to be a good question now because he pointed at you.
I hope so too.
Yes.
So currently in Israel, there's this tiny issue that's talked about. They want to integrate biometric systems and make it also, it's also talked about right now, if they should make it obligatory to all citizens. And I can think that you'd be against it, but I'd like to hear your thoughts about it.
This question is about biometric systems and integrating them. I mean, there are a lot of risks in that. There are ways to do it better and worse, right? The Apple iPhone fingerprint reader is an example of doing it better because there's no central database. I tend to worry about biometric systems because of single point of failure. That when you have a large database of biometrics, that is a very valuable thing to access, to steal, to modify, and there are a lot of attacks based on that. I tend to prefer decentralized systems. So I think we have more security in that. Right, that being said, biometrics are not new. Right? Your passport is a biometric system. It's got a photograph on it. And there is a database of photographs sitting at, in your government, my government, everybody's governments. So we have biometric systems already. And the question is how to get the benefits of them, because there are some strong benefits without making them more vulnerable. And there's a lot. So my opinions tend to be very nuanced based on how they're deployed, how they're used, what they're used for. Okay. But there's definitely value in biometric systems.
So how do you decentralize a system like that?
Well, it depends on, decentralization depends on your application. Right? So Apple was able to do it by keeping the fingerprint only on the local device and not having a central fingerprint repository. For their application, they didn't need it. Right? If you think of the way passports were used before computers, the passport was a bearer instrument that included a biometric. You walked up to the passport officer, handed him your document, he kind of checked it to see if it was forged or not, then he compared the biometric with you. Right? That was a decentralized system. Now, more likely, he's going to type the number in or scan the number, and a page comes up on the screen, which is going to be the photograph that has been in the central database. Right? So that is a more centralized system. There are different ways to design it, and really think about that when you design security systems. Single points of failure are very dangerous. Right? This is why Gmail is dangerous. Because so much email happens there, it is such a ripe target. I mean, this is why the NSA targeted it. They're not dumb. Right? That's where the mail is. We're going to get it. Now you've got feds. Congratulations. I think I have to. I mean, I'd love to stay. But I have to be on stage at Tel Aviv University at 1. So I don't know what traffic is like or anything.
One more question, maybe?
All right. So someone who knows what traffic is like says one more question, maybe. All right. Somewhere in the back. There's the back.
I'd like to talk about minor cyber criminals, like targeting citizens.
A little louder. I can't hear it.
Sorry, I'd like to ask you about cyber crimes against citizens.
Mm-hmm.
I don't see any actions from the government. Are there any?
So the question is about cyber crimes against citizens and actions by the government. I mean, there are
Like against corporations.
So what kind of crimes? Like identity theft? Yeah, so there's a lot of crimes against citizens. I mean, we're seeing a lot more government actions. Go back 15 years and it was a disaster. Police had no idea how to investigate cybercrime. We're seeing a lot more now. Certainly in the United States, the FBI has a very robust cybercrimes unit. Right? There's even like a TV show about it, so it's a big deal. Right? And I think they are doing much better. There are a lot of challenges in cybercrimes, and the big one is the international nature. And you have countries like Russia that tend to turn a blind eye to cyber criminals as long as they don't attack Russians. They can operate with impunity. Then you've also got countries, like pretty much semi-failed states in sub-Saharan Africa or Southeast Asia or Eastern Europe, where the police just really can't deal with the crime. And cybercrime is so naturally international that there's not a lot that can be done against international cybercrime except to harden yourself. So it tends to be nothing you can rely on the police for, you have to defend yourself. I think that's bad. We're seeing more. More mutual assistance treaties, MLATs, where data is being passed back and forth. There's a lot of problems with that, and there's talk about modernizing those to make it faster, to make it more efficient. So I think what you're seeing is a policy lag because governments move slowly, but I see an enormous improvement in cybercrime defense prosecution by governments, by the big Western governments in the past decade, and that's all to the good. I mean, still, and you have a lot of stuff being done in more resilience, that we are better at dealing with the effects of a large cyber theft. So Tard Corporation, the attackers come in, steal, I think it was like 80 million credit card numbers. We're now very quick at turning those off and then restarting customers. So we're getting better at making the crimes less effective, which I really think is the primary way we should deal with this. I mean, when we move to one-time credit cards, suddenly this becomes a lot harder. And that's something that's not unreasonable. So the more Apple Pay, right, which is basically a one-time credit card system. And as you move to those systems, those databases become less attractive targets because you can't use the data. So I like cybercrime defenses along those lines because I think as long as it's very international, as long as you have countries that are going to be safe havens, you're going to have this cybercrime. I mean, I want my bank to call me and say, you're transferring all your money to the Ukraine. You've never done that before. You sure you want to? Right? I'd like that phone call. That seems like a good thing for my bank to do. But if they say, well, it's his password, what the hell? That's bad. Okay, I'm really sorry. This has been fun, and I do have to go to my next thing. Thank you all for coming.